Today, we buy salt by the ton to throw on frozen asphalt. It's so cheap, cities pave the streets with it to melt ice. But if you took those same raw crystals back to the medieval Sahel, you'd be sitting on a fortune. Merchants hauling slabs of Saharan rock salt routinely traded them pound for gold dust. It raises an obvious question. How did a basic tabletop condiment hold enough economic gravity to build global empires? The answer starts with human biology. Our bodies require sodium to survive. Unlike silk or silver, salt was an absolute necessity with highly inelastic demand. Every civilization on Earth was captive to its supply. Beyond biology, it served a second, equally critical function. Before the 20th century, packing meat and fish in heavy brine was the only reliable way to keep food edible for months at a time. Armies on the march and civilians bracing for winter depended entirely on salted rations. Because it was the ultimate barrier against mass starvation, whoever controlled the salt supply held absolute geopolitical leverage. This animated map outlines the core logistical problem. While salt was relatively easy to harvest along the world's coastlines, moving it into the vast, dry interior of a continent was incredibly difficult. Gathering it meant building massive grids of shallow evaporation pans. Workers spent their days raking through thick, muddy brine under the sun, waiting for the water to evaporate and yield the white crystals. Inland, the labor was even more grueling. Extracting rock salt from subterranean deposits required carving out cavernous underground walls and operating heavy wooden wheel mechanics, a brutal task frequently assigned to convict labor. Once extracted, hauling it to the isolated populations who needed it meant navigating punishing terrain. Heavy blocks of salt were strapped to long camel trains, trekking hundreds of miles across the barren, rippled desert. West African empires like Mali recognized the vulnerability in this supply chain. By garrisoning these remote trade routes, they could aggressively tax the salt-to-gold exchange happening at the desert's edge. The brutal physical geography of moving a heavy, necessary mineral from the coast to the interior transformed it into an engine for imperial wealth. Governments around the world quickly realized the fiscal power of an inelastic biological necessity. They began engineering strict state-run monopolies over its production. The Venetian Republic built an entire corporate state around this concept. Venice rarely mined its own salt, but they enforced absolute, violent control over its trade across the Adriatic Sea. They implemented a strict legal requirement called the Ordo Salis. Venetian merchant ships were forced to return to port carrying heavy loads of salt as ballast, heavily subsidizing their imports and funding the naval dominance of the Republic. On the other side of the world, Imperial China instituted the gabelle system. For over 2.5 millennia, Chinese dynasties enforced a massive state monopoly on salt, generating the staggering revenue required to build immense public works like the Great Wall winding across these northern mountains. The British East India Company, and later the Raj, took this extraction to its absolute extreme. They imposed heavy duties that functioned as a highly regressive poll tax, draining wealth from the entire Indian population, regardless of class. To protect that revenue, the British constructed the Inland Customs Line. As you can see on this map, they drew a jagged 2,500-mile barrier directly across the subcontinent. It was a physical wall of thorny hedges, patrolled by thousands of officers, built exclusively to stop civilians from smuggling untaxed salt. The most powerful states in history understood that luxury goods were a volatile tax base. The most reliable way to fill a treasury was to monopolize a biological requirement. For centuries, these empires held an unshakable grip on the global economy. So how did they lose it? The collapse began in the mid-19th century with a single technological breakthrough, the mechanical refrigerator. The moment humanity gained the ability to keep food cold, the desperate, absolute reliance on heavy brines for preservation vanished entirely. At exactly the same time, massive chemical plants introduced vacuum evaporation and mechanical pumps, churning out bright white salt at industrial speeds. The market experienced a violent correction. With the primary need for preservation gone and supply skyrocketing to unprecedented levels, the price plummeted from the equivalent of gold down to a few pennies. Innovation solved the physical problem of scarcity. In the process, it permanently stripped the mineral of its strategic imperial power. Technology ruined the market for salt, but the final death blow to the old empires was strictly political. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi led a famous act of civilian defiance against the British tax. By organizing thousands of people to illegally harvest their own salt from the sea, Gandhi aimed a highly targeted strike directly at the fiscal heart of the colonial economic model. The strategy worked. The monopoly was eventually shattered, and the salt duty became one of the first major colonial levies completely dismantled as Indian independence approached. Today, salt operates entirely outside the realm of high politics. It is a mundane bulk commodity, shipped in cargo freighters and used primarily to manufacture chlorine and de-ice winter roads. It leaves us with a stark economic lesson. A resource has no inherent permanent worth. Its price is strictly dictated by what human technology requires at a specific point in history. Even the most entrenched global superpowers, built on the steady taxation of white gold, can be completely undone by a simple shift in human innovation.